tonight begins with a diplomatic collapse that Western officials had feared, anticipated, and worked tirelessly to prevent. It did not unfold through months of drawn-out negotiations or behind closed doors in quiet conference rooms. It happened in a single press conference in Moscow, one appearance that unraveled months of diplomacy, forced NATO allies to reassess their assumptions, and set the stage for what President Volodymyr Zelensky is now openly calling a long war. What Vladimir Putin did today crossed a line many Western leaders hoped, perhaps naively, would hold, and when it broke, Zelensky did not hesitate. He responded with resolve, in defiance, delivering a stark warning that sent shockwaves from Washington to Warsaw, from Berlin to Bucharest. A peace proposal that took months to build, shaped through consultations with more than 30 nations, and widely viewed as the most comprehensive effort to end the war since it began, was dismissed in less than 15 minutes. 15 minutes of tightly scripted rhetoric from the Kremlin. 15 minutes that stripped away any remaining ambiguity about Putin's intentions. 15 minutes that may have added years to this conflict. The speed and confidence with which the proposal was rejected told Western diplomats everything they needed to know. For weeks leading up to this moment, there were quiet signals that something was coming. Not official statements, not formal diplomatic messages, but subtle shifts that seasoned intelligence analysts recognize immediately. Putin has always been unpredictable, but his unpredictability follows a pattern. His diplomatic moves have a rhythm, a cadence that Western governments have learned to interpret over time. What triggered concern this week in Brussels and Washington was that the rhythm suddenly stopped. Those who monitor Kremlin behavior noticed the warning signs. Foreign ministry briefings slowed, then nearly vanished. State-controlled media avoided subsuming a discussion of the peace proposal altogether. A scheduled address by Putin to the Federation Council was postponed without explanation. A planned meeting between Russian and Turkish diplomats was abruptly cancelled. And when the Kremlin goes silent like this, it usually means something loud is about to follow. The NATO-backed peace proposal itself had been carefully constructed over for months and was widely viewed by diplomats as a realistic, if difficult, path toward ending the war. It outlined a phased withdrawal of Russian forces from specific occupied areas, international security guarantees for Ukraine, and a pathway toward eventual European Union membership without immediate NATO accession. It also proposed a long-term diplomatic framework for addressing the status of Crimea, deliberately postponing that most explosive issue in favor of stability and de-escalation. Western officials believed they had crafted a proposal Putin could at least consider, something that offered enough face-saving language to sell at home. They were wrong. In the days leading up to his response, intelligence agencies began noticing subtle but troubling shifts. Russian military units that had been repositioned earlier appeared to be consolidating. Supply lines that had gone quiet were suddenly active again. Most telling of all, the usual signals from Moscow's second-tier officials, the spokespeople and deputy ministers who often hint at the Kremlin's direction, fell completely silent. When that happens, experienced observers know to brace themselves. Early Thursday morning, Western intelligence detected what was described as an unusual burst of activity inside the Kremlin, including a hastily arranged press conference scheduled just 6 hours before it took place. These are the kinds of sudden diplomatic moves Putin reserves for moments when he wants to send a very specific message. Total rejection, strategic repositioning, preparation for escalation, or all three at once. Western capitals did not yet know which category this would fall into, but they understood one thing clearly: Putin was changing posture. And when a nuclear-armed autocrat shifts posture without explanation, even slightly, intelligence agencies from Langley to London take notice. The press conference lasted about 45 minutes, but the most consequential part, Putin's response to the peace proposal, took only 15. In that short window, he dismantled the framework piece by piece. He dismissed the proposed territorial arrangements as surrender dressed up as compromise. He labeled the security guarantees meaningless promises from an alliance he accused of open hostility. He rejected the pathway toward EU membership as a disguised route into NATO through what he called economic domination. Most decisively, he declared that Crimea was not, and never would be, a subject for negotiation. The rejection was absolute, comprehensive, and clearly prepared in advance. Analysts reviewing the transcript later noted the precision of Putin's language, unusually detailed and deliberate, suggesting the Kremlin had been crafting this response for days, perhaps even weeks. While many in the diplomatic community still believed talks were inching forward, the warning issued by President Zelensky that night made it clear that this moment was different. It was not routine, not symbolic, but urgent. After emergency consultations, senior officials described Putin's dismissal as calculated and provocative, and above all, revealing of his true objectives. Diplomatic rejection only succeeds if it breaks the resolve of the other side. Ukraine did not then. Instead, Zelensky's response was among the most defiant since the earliest days of the full-scale invasion, signaling that Kyiv had already begun preparing for a much longer and far more difficult days of this war. Here's what we know. Within 3 hours of Putin's press conference, President Zelensky convened an emergency session of Ukraine's war cabinet. These were not routine weekly consultations. These were crisis-level meetings, the kind Ukraine holds only when it is preparing to fundamentally reassess its strategic posture. Within 6 hours, Zelensky addressed the Ukrainian people directly. Within 8 hours, he had spoken with the leaders of the United States, the United Kingdom, France, Germany, and Poland. And within 12 hours, he delivered a warning not just to Ukraine, but to the world. That warning was stark. Ukraine, he said, must prepare for a prolonged conflict, one that could stretch well into the next decade. Zelensky did not soften the message. He spoke openly about economic strain, continued casualties, and a psychological toll on a nation that has already endured more than 3 years of full-scale war. But alongside that realism was resolve. He spoke with calm determination and an unshakable belief that Ukraine would prevail, regardless of how long the fight might take. Multiple sources have since confirmed that shortly after Putin's rejection, Ukraine launched a significant military operation targeting Russian logistics infrastructure. Among the targets was a major fuel depot in Kursk Oblast that had recently been expanded, a move analysts believe was part of preparations for a summer offensive. Ukraine struck before Russia could consolidate. They hit the fuel depot in Kursk. They struck a command center in Belgorod that had been coordinating drone operations against Ukrainian cities. They targeted rail infrastructure near Voronezh that was likely being prepared to transport additional ammunition to the front. In other words, Ukraine went after the backbone of Russia's offensive capability, the systems that would have made a renewed push possible. This is what makes Zelensky's warning so significant. Putin's rejection was not merely diplomatic theater. It was a signal that military pressure was about to intensify. It marked a strategic pivot that could reshape the battlefield if weapon answered. Ukraine recognized that immediately and responded with force, but not recklessly and not impulsively. They did not target civilians. They did not escalate to prohibited weapons. They struck military logistics, command infrastructure, and the machinery that sustains war. Defense analysts speaking to Western media noted that Ukraine's response reflected a level of intelligence integration, precision, and operational maturity that has steadily improved throughout the conflict. These targets were not chosen at random. Each reflected careful analysis of Russia's most vulnerable pressure points. The fuel depot in Kursk, for example, had been identified months ago as a critical supply node for the southern front. Its destruction will force Russia to rely on more distant facilities, lengthening supply lines and creating new weaknesses. The command center in Belgorod had coordinated drone campaigns that have terrorized Ukrainian cities for months, and disabling it, even temporarily, offers valuable relief for Ukrainian air defenses. The rail infrastructure near Voronezh forms part of the network Russia uses to move equipment and personnel from its interior to the front. Disrupting it creates delays that ripple through the entire Russian military system. And this is where the story becomes even more consequential. Western intelligence agencies now believe that Putin's rejection was intended as a test of NATO's resolve. After months of internal debate across the alliance about the future of support for Ukraine, Moscow wanted to see whether unity would fracture, whether individual governments would begin urging Kyiv to accept worse terms, and whether the strain of a prolonged war would finally crack the coalition. Instead, the opposite happened. NATO did not waver. It issued a joint statement so clear and unified that it immediately drew attention in Moscow. Gaining the Kremlin's notice is not easy, but this time the Western alliance did exactly that. Intelligence officials speaking anonymously to major outlets described Putin's move as a strategic miscalculation, an attempt to exploit what he perceived as weakness that instead exposed unexpected strength. The response from the alliance was not only firm, it was synchronized with remarkable precision. Statements from Washington, London, Berlin, and Paris appeared within minutes of one another, using nearly identical language. That level of coordination was not accidental. It showed that member states had prepared in advance for the possibility of rejection. This matters because it reveals an alliance that is no longer simply reacting to events, but anticipating them. The intelligence community had clearly wargamed this scenario. Response frameworks were in place. Diplomatic language had been prepared, and when the moment arrived, it was executed with a discipline that surprised even experienced observers. It marked the notable evolution in NATO's approach. In the early months of the war, the alliance often appeared reactive, struggling to keep pace with Russian moves. now a demonstrated proactive coordination that reflects real institutional learning. As more information emerged throughout the evening, the scale of the international response became clearer. NATO Secretary-General Jens Stoltenberg conducted emergency consultations with all 32 member states, triggering a comprehensive reassessment of military assistance and delivery timelines. The European Union moved to accelerate sanctions on economic sectors that had been under discussion for months, pulling decisions forward that were originally planned for later in the year. The United States, operating through multiple channels, reportedly fast-tracked the delivery of long-range strike capabilities that had been held back pending diplomatic outcomes. This was not simply disappointment expressed in words. It was not symbolic condemnation. It was strategic realignment. It was coalition reinforcement, the one outcome Moscow has consistently failed to prevent since the invasion began in February 2022. At every diplomatic turn, Russia has attempted to weaken Western unity, and at every turn, the response has instead strengthened Ukraine's position. Sanctions, though imperfect, have forced Russia to reorient its economy around wartime production. Military aid, sometimes delayed, has still delivered capabilities Moscow did not anticipate. Diplomatic isolation, while not absolute, has pushed Russia into a level of global marginalization not seen since the collapse of the Soviet Union. Putin's gamble was that rejecting the peace proposal would project strength and expose Western fatigue. Instead, it appears to have accelerated precisely the forces he was trying to stop. Putin believed the peace proposal was evidence of Western exhaustion. He interpreted NATO's willingness to include face-saving provisions as desperation, a sign that the alliance wanted the war to end at almost any cost. He assumed that a decisive rejection would expose fractures he could exploit. Tonight, that assumption is collapsing. The alliance appears more unified than it has been in months. Military aid packages that had stalled are now being fast-tracked. Countries that had hesitated are recommitting with renewed urgency. This pattern has repeated throughout the war. Each time Putin has anticipated Western weakness, he has instead triggered Western resolve. The initial invasion was meant to shatter Ukrainian resistance and divide NATO. Instead, it produced the most unified Western response since the Cold War. Energy pressure was supposed to break Europe's will. Instead, it accelerated the continent's move away from Russian hydrocarbons. Nuclear threats were meant to intimidate Western leaders. Instead, they reinforced the global taboo against nuclear coercion. Now, the rejection of the peace proposal was intended to project strength. Instead, it has exposed Putin's unwillingness to accept any outcome short of Ukraine's complete submission. History will likely remember this as yet another strategic miscalculation. What makes this moment especially dangerous is that Putin's rejection comes amid intense domestic pressure. Hardliners within the security establishment demand total victory in the subjugation of Ukraine. Economic pragmatists want relief from sanctions that are steadily constricting Russian industry. Military commanders seek respite from a grinding war of attrition that has already cost hundreds of thousands of casualties. And ordinary Russians, though largely silenced, want an end to a war that has brought only loss. Putin is trying to balance these competing forces while facing the most serious military setbacks since the failure of the Kyiv offensive. When leaders act abruptly under these conditions, they are not operating from confidence. They are acting under strain and vulnerability. Seeing in this light, the rejection of the peace proposal was not about diplomacy at all. It was about survival at home. Putin needed to prove to hardliners that he remains committed to maximalist war aims. Even acknowledging the NATO proposal as a basis for talks would have been interpreted as weakness by the factions that matter most to his hold on power. This is the trap he has created for himself. The war has produced constituencies that benefit from its continuation: the military-industrial complex, the security services, state propagandists, and regional officials whose influence now depends on perpetual mobilization. These groups have a vested interest in prolonging the conflict regardless of the cost to Russia as a whole. Putin, who once shaped the narrative completely, is now constrained by it. NATO's response reflected a clear understanding of this reality. Its statement, circulated to member government and international partners, signaled that the alliance has no intention of abandoning the Ukraine, no matter how long the war lasts. Officials made it clear that Putin's rejection is incompatible with any genuine pursuit of peace. In diplomatic terms, that is a blunt message. The pretense is over. The tone was sharper than usual for NATO's typically conscious bureaucracy, a sign that the stakes are rising. The statement went further than previous declarations, explicitly referencing Article 5 and reaffirming the alliance's commitment to defend its territory against any spillover from the war. It underscored security guarantees for the Baltic states and announced accelerated military exercises in Poland and Romania. The message was unmistakable. Rejecting peace does not translate into permission for expansion. Secretary of State Antony Blinken, speaking after consultations with NATO counterparts, was equally blunt. He said Putin had made a clear choice for more war, more suffering, and deeper isolation. Britain's Foreign Secretary echoed that assessment and announced that additional military support would be unveiled in the coming days. Germany's Chancellor, usually measured and cautious, hailed the rejection a moment of clarity that removed any remaining doubt about Putin's intentions. And in Paris, President Emmanuel Macron, who has often been criticized for leaving the door open to dialogue with Moscow, issued one of his strongest statements yet, calling Putin's decision a historic error that Russia will ultimately regret. At the same time, President Zelensky addressed the Ukrainian people in a somber, resolute speech. His words were calm. It was unmistakably firm. He said the world had finally seen what Ukrainians had understood for years. Russia does not want peace. It wants submission, and Ukraine will never submit. He reminded his people that Ukraine had offered a path to ending the war with dignity for all sides, a path that was rejected. Now, he said, the country must walk along a road, but it will walk that road together. He was candid about what lies ahead. For years to come, he warned, will be difficult. They will demand sacrifice. They will test endurance. But Ukraine has been tested before, he said. And Ukraine has prevailed before, and it will prevail again. These were not empty words or political theatrics. They were the statements of a leader who understands just how high the stakes have become and who chose honesty over false reassurance. Zelensky's shift in tone was striking. Throughout much of the war, he has spoken with confident optimism, often framing victory in terms of months rather than years. Tonight marked a clear departure. He spoke openly about the strain of sustained mobilization, the economic pressure of a long war, and the exhaustion that comes after more than 3 years of relentless fighting. Yegzwikwain these realities not absence for despair wrote as a test of national character. Every great nation, he said, faces moments when the easy path and the right path diverge. Ukraine, he declared, has chosen the right path, and history will remember that choice. The address was broadcast not only across Ukraine but to international audiences, translated into multiple languages. That was deliberate. It served the purposes at once, preparing Ukrainians for what comes next, and signaling to partners abroad that Ukraine's commitment does not waver with the calendar. Those dual messages will shape the months and years ahead as the conflict enters a new phase. This phase is likely to be defined less by dramatic breakthroughs and more by attrition, industrial capacity, and societal resilience. In that environment, Ukraine's advantages remain clear: continued Western backing, high morale, and the fundamental strength that comes from defending one's own home. Russia, of course, brings its own set of advantages into this next phase of the war. It has a larger population, deeper natural resources, and an economy that has been aggressively restructured around wartime production. Ultimately, the outcome will hinge on which of these competing advantages proves more sustainable over time, and on whether external variables, especially political shifts in Western capitals, alter the balance. Tonight, intelligence officials say they are closely monitoring Russian military positions for signs of offensive preparation. They report that Russian forces are consolidating in several sectors, suggesting possible repositioning for a larger operation. Supply movements have increased along key logistical corridors, and analysts believe Putin's rejection of the peace proposal is likely part of a broader strategic recalibration aimed at securing battlefield gains that could strengthen Russia's position in any future negotiations. Ukraine, however, is not waiting passively for events to unfold. On the contrary, it is accelerating its own preparations. The response we saw today was swift, coordinated, and deliberately proportionate. It sent a clear message to Moscow that rejecting diplomacy does not grant a free hand for unchecked aggression. At the same time, it reassured Western capitals that Ukraine remains a disciplined and reliable partner, one that uses the support it receives effectively and responsibly. The military strikes carried out in the hours after Putin's announcement demonstrated not just capability, the restraint. Targets were chosen carefully, civilian areas were avoided, and the operations were designed to achieve concrete military objectives while limiting escalation risks. This has been a defining feature of Ukraine's conduct throughout the war, and it has played a crucial role in sustaining international backing. Even under intense pressure, Ukraine has consistently adhered to the norms that separate it from its adversary. As more information emerges in the coming hours and days, we will learn more about what Putin ultimately hoped to achieve with his sweeping rejection of the peace framework. What is already clear is that the Western response came quickly enough to prevent Moscow from dominating the narrative. It showcased alliance unity at a moment when Russia was clearly hoping to expose divisions, and it sent a powerful signal to Kyiv that support will not disappear simply because diplomacy has stalled. What happens next will depend on the choices Putin makes in the weeks and months ahead. If he moves toward genuine de-escalation, this episode may be remembered as a missed opportunity that eventually gave way to reason. If he chooses further escalation, Ukraine and his partners have already shown they're prepared, attentive, and ready to respond. The mechanisms for additional support are in place, the political will remains firm, and the moral clarity that has shaped the Western response since February 2022 has not faded. Putin's gamble has always been that time would work in Russia's favor, that democratic societies would grow weary, and that the complexities of maintaining a coalition would eventually create openings to exploit. So far, that gamble has failed. Tonight's events suggest it is unlikely to succeed in the near future either. And tonight, for the first time in months, the Kremlin appears uncertain. Moscow is quiet, perhaps too quiet, and when Putin goes quiet, it's rarely a sign of calm. It means he is calculating. It means he is weighing his options in choosing his next move with care, because tonight, Vladimir Putin was reminded of something he has learned before, and yet repeatedly seems determined to ignore. Ukraine will not break, the West will not walk away from its commitments, and sustained aggression does not earn rewards. This story is far from finished. The war that began in February 2022 has now entered its most uncertain phase yet. The fragile hopes for a negotiated settlement that had slowly taken shape over recent months have collapsed, and the timeline of the conflict has stretched outward, no longer measured in weeks or seasons, but potentially in years. Both sides are now preparing for a long struggle, yet one truth stands out with clarity tonight. Ukraine is ready for that challenge. Its partners remain committed to standing with it, and the principles at stake: sovereignty, territorial integrity, and the right of nations to choose their own future remain worth defending, no matter how long that defense requires. President Zelensky's warning about a prolonged conflict was sobering, but it was also honest. In a world too often shaped by denial and wishful thinking, that honesty is a form of strength. Ukraine has chosen the difficult path of truth over the comforting illusion of easy answers, and history will remember that choice. The months ahead will test everyone involved. They will test Ukraine's endurance and resilience. They will test Western unity and long-term commitment. They will test Russian society's tolerance for a needless and costly war, and they will test the international system's ability to uphold the principles it claims to defend. But tests reveal character, and the character revealed so far suggests that this story, however long it lasts, will not end with those principles erased. It will end with them still standing. We will be here, watching closely as the next phase unfolds. The world shifted today, not with a dramatic shock or a single headline that dominates for weeks, but in a deeper, more fundamental way. The prospect of a near-term negotiated settlement has receded. The reality of prolonged conflict has moved forward. Ukraine, Russia, NATO, and the wider international community must now adjust to that reality. For Ukraine, it means preparing for years of continued resistance. For Russia, it means confronting the fact that a quick victory is no longer possible. For NATO, it means committing resources, attention, and political will for the long haul. And for all of us observing from the outside, it means recognizing that this conflict will shape international politics for a generation. Tonight's events were not the end of anything. They were the beginning of a new chapter, one written in sacrifice, in determination, in struggle and resilience, and in the daily choices of millions who refuse to accept that might makes right. That story will continue tomorrow, and the day after, and for as long as it takes, because some things are worth fighting for, and the freedom of a nation to decide its own future is among them. This is the reality President Zelensky acknowledged tonight. This is the reality Vladimir Putin's rejection has created. And this is the reality that will define the years ahead.